Salam sejahtera, anda sedang menyaksikan Niaga AWANI bersama saya Nina Rozman. Seperti biasa jam ini kami akan bawakan pelbagai rangkuman berita niaga, ekonomi termasuk juga dengan untuk kita teliti lebih mendalam bagaimanakah prestasi pasaran bukan sahaja di peringkat nasional tapi sehinggalah ke peringkat antarabangsa. Dan saya akan mulakan dengan laporan ini terlebih dahulu dengan Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim bersama delegasi Malaysia tiba di Rom bagi memulakan lawatan rasmi selama 3 hari atas jemputan rasmi Perdana Menteri Itali Giorgia Meloni. Pesawat sewaan khas Malaysia Airlines yang membawa beliau mendarat di lapangan terbang antarabangsa Fiumicino Leonardo da Vinci sekitar 8.30 malam waktu tempatan.
Ketibaan Anwar disambut oleh Duta Kanan Hal Ehwal Protokol Itali Fabrizio Romano dan bekas Duta Besar Itali ke Malaysia Massimo Rustico. Menyambut Anwar mewakili delegasi Malaysia pula adalah Menteri Luar Datuk Seri Muhammad Hassan dan Duta Besar Malaysia ke Itali Datuk Zahid Rastam. Dalam kenyataan yang dimuat naik sejurus ketibaan, Anwar menegaskan bahawa kunjungan ini mencerminkan komitmen bersama kedua-dua negara untuk memperkukuh hubungan dua hala yang telah lama terjalin berlandaskan prinsip persahabatan, keyakinan dan saling menghormati. Malaysia katanya melihat Itali sebagai rakan strategik penting di benua Eropah. Justru Malaysia komited untuk memperluas kerjasama dalam bidang perdagangan dan pelaburan, industri pertahanan serta sektor peralihan tenaga. Selaku pengerusi ASEAN, Anwar memanfaatkan kunjungan ini sebagai peluang untuk memperkukuh hubungan antara Asia Tenggara dan Eropah dalam hadapi cabaran geopolitik dan geoekonomi yang semakin kompleks. Beliau turut menzahirkan keyakinan bahawa lawatan ini bukan sahaja akan membuka lembaran baharu yang lebih dinamik dalam hubungan Malaysia-Itali, tetapi juga menterjemah impak dan manfaat kepada rakyat. Perdana Menteri dijangka mengadakan pertemuan dua hala bersama pemimpin tertinggi Itali serta sesi libat urus dengan pemain industri dan komuniti perniagaan selain memperkukuh kerjasama strategik dalam pelbagai sektor bernilai tinggi. Ini merupakan jemputan rasmi pertama oleh Perdana Menteri Itali kepada Perdana Menteri Malaysia dalam tempoh 10 tahun.
Keberadaan rakyat Malaysia di segenap pelosok dunia dianggap sebagai aset penting kepada negara. Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim menegaskan diaspora Malaysia berperanan sebagai duta kecil yang bawa nama negara di persada antarabangsa.
Justru Anwar menitipkan pesan agar mereka terus merebut setiap peluang dan ruang untuk memperkukuh ilmu, kemahiran dan jaringan demi menyumbang semula kepada tanah air. Beliau berucap di Majlis Ramah Mesra bersama diaspora Malaysia yang menetap di Itali pada Selasa. Dalam pertemuan itu, Anwar turut mengambil kesempatan untuk berkongsi pelbagai usaha, dasar dan ikhtiar kerajaan Madani dalam memperjuangkan kebajikan rakyat serta hala tuju masa depan negara di sebalik ketidaktentuan geopolitik dan geoekonomi dunia. Majlis ini merupakan sebahagian daripada jadual lawatan rasmi beliau ke Itali atas jemputan rakan sejawatnya Giorgia Meloni. Tahun lalu, jumlah dagangan antara Malaysia dan Itali mencatatkan peningkatan 2% kepada 14.61 bilion ringgit berbanding 2023. Manakala bagi tempoh Januari hingga Mei tahun ini, jumlah dagangan terus menunjukkan prestasi positif dengan peningkatan 3.3% kepada 6.50 bilion ringgit atau 1.48 bilion dolar Amerika berbanding tempoh sama bagi tahun 2024. Itali adalah rakan dagang kelima terbesar Malaysia dalam kalangan negara Kesatuan Eropah dan pengimport ketiga terbesar minyak sawit Malaysia dari blok tersebut bagi tahun 2024.
Baik, untuk kita teliti bagaimanakah keluaran dalam negeri kasar ataupun pertumbuhan ekonomi Malaysia pada tahun 2024, saya akan teruskan kongsi angka dan prestasi ini daripada Jabatan Perakaan Malaysia DOSM untuk kita meliti bagaimanakah pertumbuhan KDNK pada tahun lepas. Pertamanya, kalau kita melihat untuk 5 negeri yang tumbuh melebihi pertumbuhan nasional adalah melibatkan negeri Johor, Selangor, wilayah Persekutuan Kuala Lumpur, Pahang, wilayah Persekutuan Labuan, dan ini juga merupakan antara 5 negeri menjadi pemacu utama untuk keseluruhan KDNK ataupun pertumbuhan ekonomi Malaysia. Dan 6 negeri ini telah menyumbang sebanyak 73.4% kepada KDNK nasional, termasuk negeri Selangor, KL, Johor, Sarawak, Pulau Pinang dan juga Perak. Selain itu, untuk kita lihat bagaimanakah pertumbuhan dan sumbangan KDNK negeri pada harga mala 2015. Di sini kalau anda dapat saksikan untuk setiap negeri di Malaysia, angka-angka ini menunjukkan ataupun mencerminkan pertumbuhan pada tahun 2024 antara prestasi yang terkini. Kalau boleh kita saksikan, antara 6 negeri itu 6.3% adalah direkodkan oleh Selangor, Kuala Lumpur 6.2%, Johor 6.4% pertumbuhan KDNK-nya. Pahang pada 2024 juga mencatat melebihi paras nasional 5.7% dan juga wilayah Persekutuan Labuan juga merekodkan 5.4%. Namun secara keseluruhan pada tahun 2024, Malaysia pertumbuhannya sendiri telah merekodkan sebanyak 5.1%. Peningkatan lebih tinggi berbanding tahun sebelumnya iaitu sebanyak 3.5%. Dan pada tahun lepas, Malaysia telah merekodkan banyak 1,650.3 bilion ringgit hasil negara yang telah direkodkan pada tahun lepas. Selain itu, untuk kita lihat pertumbuhan dan sumbangan negeri, melihat bagaimanakah sumbangan mereka terhadap setiap sektor di Malaysia ini. Kita mulakan dengan sektor pertanian. Secara keseluruhan telah meningkat 3.1% pada tahun 2024. Antara pertumbuhan pertanian, sektor pertanian yang paling tinggi, pertumbuhannya adalah berada di negara, kalau kita lihat, maafkan saya, di negeri Pahang, iaitu 8.4% dengan sumbangan kepada KDNK Malaysia oleh Pahang dalam sektor pertanian adalah 14.8%, diikuti juga dengan yang kedua tertinggi pertumbuhan pertanian di Johor sebanyak 4.2% dan sektor pertanian di Johor ini telah menyumbang 17.3% kepada KDNK Malaysia secara keseluruhan. Melihat kepada sektor kedua iaitu pelombongan dan perkoran mencatatkan pertumbuhan sebanyak 0.9% pada tahun 2024. Antara yang tertinggi pertumbuhannya adalah di negeri Selangor dan juga Johor. Dan sektor pembuatan juga meningkat 4.2% dengan sumbangan kepada KDNK Malaysia sebanyak 23.1%. Antara negeri yang mempunyai pertumbuhan dalam sektor pembuatan pada tahun 2024 adalah daripada negeri Selangor merekodkan 5.1% dan sektor pembuatan di Selangor telah menyumbang hampir mencecah 33%. Bukan itu saja, kita lihat pembinaan antara pertumbuhan yang paling tinggi di Malaysia kalau kita lihat di sini dengan pertumbuhan 17.5%, sumbangan kepada KDNK 4.0%. Ini adalah prestasi pada tahun 2024. Dan kita lihat setiap pertumbuhan sektor pembinaan di setiap negeri ini mengalami pertumbuhan 2 digit. Dan yang paling tinggi adalah daripada sektor Johor, pertumbuhan pembinaan di negeri Johor adalah 42.7%. Dan antara sumbangan yang tertinggi sektor pembuatan terdapat di lokasi Selangor dengan menyumbang dalam sektor pembinaan dan menyumbang kepada KDNK Malaysia sebanyak 33.8% yang telah dicatatkan oleh Selangor. Manakala perkhidmatan juga telah menyumbang sebanyak 59.4%, lebih daripada separuh kepada pertumbuhan KDNK Malaysia. Dengan pertumbuhan pada tahun 2024, sektor perkhidmatan merekodkan 5.3%. Dan ini juga merupakan antara 6 negeri yang menyumbang kepada sektor perkhidmatan: Selangor, Johor, Sarawak, wilayah Persekutuan Kuala Lumpur, Pulau Pinang dan juga Perak. Antara penyumbang tertinggi, kita lihat penyumbang tinggi kepada KDNK Malaysia adalah daripada negeri Selangor dan juga wilayah Persekutuan Kuala Lumpur. Dan antara pertumbuhan yang tertinggi direkodkan sektor pertanian adalah di negeri Selangor dan Johor. Masing-masingnya mencatat ataupun merekodkan pertumbuhan lebih daripada 6%. Baik, ini adalah sedikit untuk kita menyaksikan bagaimanakah pertumbuhan setiap ekonomi negeri di Malaysia pada tahun 2024. Sudah bersedia dalam talian juga untuk bantu kita fahami angka dan prestasi ini adalah Profesor Emeritus Datuk Dr. Zakaria Abdul Rashid, merupakan penganalisis ekonomi. Saya nak ucapkan terima kasih Datuk kerana sudi meluangkan masa bersama kami melihat kepada setiap ekonomi negeri pada tahun 2024 mencatatkan pertumbuhan yang agak kukuh dengan 5 ke 6 negeri mencatat pertumbuhan melebihi paras nasional. Antara yang paling tinggi adalah Johor. Mungkin Datuk boleh kongsikan dahulu apakah antara pandangan Datuk terhadap prestasi ini dan bagaimanakah pertumbuhan ekonomi setiap negeri yang dapat kita saksikan sejarahnya sehinggalah tahun 2024.
Ya, terima kasih banyak Nina. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Prestasi ekonomi tahun 2024 saya rasa telah kita ulas dalam pertemuan yang lalu, iaitu ekonomi keseluruhannya tumbuh pada 5.1%. Cuma kali ini kita dibekalkan dengan data-data yang lebih terperinci tentang pertumbuhan KDNK dan juga tentang KDNK negeri-negeri di Malaysia ini, di Semenanjung dan juga termasuk di Sabah dan Sarawak. Pemerhatian saya ialah dulu waktu kita katakan 5.1% itu pada tahun 2024 tahun lepas adalah satu prestasi yang sangat baik berbanding dengan negara-negara lain. Kita bandingkan dengan negara-negara lain dan juga termasuk dengan negara ASEAN 5.1% baik. Kali ini bila kita duel lagi lebih terperinci dengan negeri-negeri, kita dapati bahawa semua negeri mendapat manfaat daripada pertumbuhan 5.1% itu, dan tentunya ada negeri yang tumbuh lebih pantas, ada negeri yang tumbuh lebih perlahan daripada 5.1%. Jadi 5.1% itu ialah pertumbuhan nasional. Jadi ada yang lebih pantas, maknanya dia lebih pada 5.1%, tadi pun Nina dah sebut negeri-negeri dia, dan juga ada negeri yang terkebelakang. Terkebelakang maknanya dia rendah daripada 5.1%. Observation saya ialah trend seperti ini adalah perkara biasa. Bermakna dalam kita menyatakan tentang kadar purata pertumbuhan atau kadar nasional, tentu ada yang lebih tinggi, ada yang lebih rendah. Ada negeri yang lebih tinggi, ada negeri yang lebih rendah. Cuma pemerhatian saya awalnya ialah trend seperti ini berlanjutan dalam tempoh yang agak lama. Bermakna negeri-negeri yang tadi Nina sebut sebagai negeri yang tumbuh dengan pantas, macam Selangor, Johor dan sebagainya, itu ada 5 negeri itu yang pantas. Consistently mereka tumbuh dengan pantas almost setiap tahun. Dan negeri-negeri yang tumbuh terkebelakang sedikit itu seperti Kedah, Kelantan, Terengganu, Perlis, negeri-negeri itu consistently pun tumbuh dengan perlahan. Kadang-kadang dia tumbuh dengan pantas, tapi tumbuh dengan perlahan. Cuma di sini yang merisaukan saya ialah kalau trend seperti ini berterusan, bermakna dari segi kesenjangan wilayah, saya rasa itu satu perkara yang harus kita perhatikan. Makna dia kalau kita lihat macam contohnya Selangor, Selangor sahaja menyumbang saya rasa dekat 1/4 daripada ekonomi nasional. 25% saya fikir kat situ cerita yang tadi tu. Jadi sebenarnya kalau dulu Selangor lebih kurang dia bermula dengan, waktu saya mula melihat data-data ini, dalam 18, 19, 20, setiap tahun dia makin bertambah. Tandanya apa? Tandanya ialah Selangor memang sebuah negeri yang agresif dalam pertumbuhan ekonomi dia. Tapi negeri-negeri yang lain macam katakan Kelantan, Kedah kan, selalunya ketinggalan ke belakang. Jadi kalau kita biarkan trend seperti gini berlanjutan buat masa yang lama, dan sebenarnya pun dah lama berlaku gini, dan ini akan menimbulkan masalah kesenjangan tadi. Jadi sesuatu usaha harus patut dilakukan bagi merapatkan kesenjangan wilayah ini. Kita cakap dari segi, kalau kita nak lihat dari segi Gini koefisien wilayah, Gini koefisien wilayahnya, begitulah keadaannya. Dan ini akan mencerminkan pendapatan ataupun pendapatan negeri, KDNK negeri per kapita. KDNK negeri per kapita akan berbeza. Kalau kita lihat KDNK negeri, yang paling tinggi sekali kat sini ialah Sarawak. KDNK per kapita Sarawak. Kemudiannya negeri macam yang tinggi juga macam Pulau Pinang, Selangor, Johor, ini negeri-negeri yang tinggi per kapitanya. Tetapi negeri-negeri macam Perlis, Kelantan, Terengganu masih jauh ketinggalan lagi. Jadi yang merisaukan saya juga, kita nak mencapai kepada sebuah negara berpendapatan tinggi. Sebuah negara berpendapatan tinggi pada 2030. Kalau kita tak address isu kesenjangan wilayah ini, nanti kita akan bertanya pada ketika kita sampai pada 2030 nanti, iaitu apalah jadi kepada negeri-negeri yang terkebelakang ini. Di mana negara telah mencapai negeri maju atau status negara maju, negeri-negeri yang terkebelakang ini dia belum lagi sampai ke sebuah negeri maju. Jadi akan ada banyak isu-isu sosial dan isu politik yang akan terkait sama dalam soal kesenjangan ini. Dan seterusnya ialah mengapa dia jadi demikian? Mengapa dia jadi demikian? Dan saya fikir kalau dari segi ekonomi teorinya, kita boleh katakan kerana comparative advantage. Kerana setiap negeri mempunyai kelebihan kelebihan bandingan, comparative advantage berbanding dengan negeri lain. Contohnya macam kita ambil Sarawak, ia mengeluarkan banyak gas dan minyak. Jadi dia negeri yang terkaya, per kapitanya, GDP per kapitanya paling tinggi sekali. Kalau kita lihat negeri seperti Sabah pula, dia bukan mengeluarkan minyak, tapi dia bergantung kepada concentrationnya, bergantung kepada minyak sawit. Dan pendapatan per kapita, KDNK-nya adalah yang agak tergolong pada yang rendah. Begitu juga Kedah, negeri pertanian. Macam Selangor, negeri manufacturing. Dia ada trade, dia ada manufacturing, elektronik, Pulau Pinang. Jadi ada comparative advantage yang berbeza-beza sini. Dan comparative advantage ini pun boleh kita urus melalui pelaburan-pelaburan yang kita bawa masuk, sama ada daripada FDI ataupun daripada pelaburan tempatan. So kita rancang betul-betul, kita akan boleh dapatkan satu pertumbuhan yang lebih seimbang antara wilayah. Negeri yang maju boleh menolong negeri yang kurang maju dalam satu semangat persekutuan Malaysia yang lebih yang lebih makmur. Dan perkara kedua yang menyebabkan kepada perbezaan ini adalah disebabkan oleh dipanggil sebagai locational advantage kerana kedudukannya. Kerana misalnya katakan Selangor, dia adalah di central, dia di center, di pusat, berdekat dengan Kuala Lumpur. Kemudiannya dia ada banking sector yang baik. Kemudian dia ada pelabuhan Port Klang yang baik. Macam di Pulau Pinang dia ada pelabuhan yang baik. Tetapi bagi negeri-negeri yang jauh daripada kemudahan-kemudahan ini, so locational advantage-nya adalah kurang. Jadi kita yang mengurus ekonomi ini kita boleh selesaikan perkara ini dengan melalui satu pengurusan dan dasar ekonomi yang menarik pelaburan-pelaburan supaya pertumbuhannya akan menjadi lebih seimbang. Tapi saya katakan tadi perbezaan ini sebenarnya tidaklah menjadi satu perkara yang boleh memeranjatkan, kerana saya katakan tadi perbezaan pasti ada. Kat mana-mana dunia pun perbezaan ada, tapi kita anggap sebagai perbezaan ini sebagai satu dynamism yang membantu kita bergerak maju ke depan lagi. Ya, sampai situ juga Nina.
Okey. Baik, seperti yang Datuk kongsikan bahawa jelas menunjukkan negeri Selangor yang lebih agresif menjadi antara penyumbang, mereka menjadi antara penyumbang utama kepada KDNK nasional. Namun apa kebimbangan utama pada ketika ini adalah untuk kita meliti, untuk kita pastikan kesenjangan itu yang terus membawa kita kepada perbincangan, adakah kita memerlukan dasar yang lebih bersifat wilayah, yang lebih sifat bersasar agar kita dapat kurangkan kesenjangan itu, termasuk juga dengan memperkukuhkan kekuatan negeri masing-masing. Tapi sebelum kita pergi kepada tahap yang lebih tegas seperti contoh dasar ini, mungkin Datuk boleh kongsikan apakah antara strategi ekonomi yang boleh negeri-negeri lain pelajari, terutama yang mempunyai KDNK bawah paras nasional ini dalam menjadikan Selangor ini terus dominan dalam sektor perkhidmatan dan pembuatan. Apa yang negeri-negeri lain boleh belajar daripada ekonomi negeri Selangor?
Tadi saya katakan tadi setiap negeri mempunyai competitive advantage yang berbeza-beza. Jadi kita tidaklah perlu macam katakan Kedah lah ataupun Terengganu lah. Tidaklah perlu mengikut seperti mana jejak langkah Selangor dengan dengan mewujudkan industri pembuatan gitu, elektronik lah misalnya. Kita yang ikut juga macam di Pulau Pinang kata. Tetapi kita mempelajari competitive advantage masing-masing. Contohnya macam Kedah. Kedah adalah sebuah negeri pertanian. Jadi apa yang boleh dilakukan ialah mengambil advantage daripada sana. Daripada negeri Kedah itu, dia mempunyai tanah yang luas, kemudiannya aktiviti-aktiviti pertanian, padi, dan juga aktiviti-aktiviti pertanian lain, dan juga mungkin adanya pelumbungan yang boleh menghasilkan perkara yang baik. Cuma kita tak boleh berhenti sampai di situ saja. Apa yang perlu dilakukan ialah dengan comparative advantage sumber alam yang ada itu, kita tambah nilai, kita pertingkatkan lagi dengan nilai tambahnya. Bermakna kita juga akan memasuki bidang manufacturing ataupun bidang apa yang dipanggil sebagai downstream activities daripada sumber-sumber alam itu. Begitu juga macam katakan di Terengganu pun sama juga, saya fikir Terengganu mempunyai sumber minyak yang baik, yang kaya, tapi saya pun dipahamkan memang ia mempunyai beberapa cabaran dan halangan untuk meningkatkan aktiviti-aktiviti downstream di dalam industri minyak. Dan begitu juga seperti di negara-negara lain. Misalnya contohnya kalau kita lihat, kita ambil contoh negeri yang macam saya katakan GDP per kapitanya yang tinggi seperti Sarawak. Ya. Tapi Sarawak mempunyai masalah yang lain pula. Sebab walaupun GDP per kapitanya tinggi, situ satu bab. Bab yang lain yang berkaitannya ialah bagaimana kemajuan ekonomi negeri-negeri tadi disampaikan kepada orang ramai. Misalnya kita tahu, saya selalu akan sebut bahawa Sarawak misalnya adalah sebuah negeri yang GDP per kapitanya paling tinggi sekali. Paling tinggi di Malaysia ini. Tetapi kadar kemiskinannya juga adalah antara negeri yang mempunyai kadar kemiskinan yang perlu diberikan perhatian yang serius juga. Jadi ada dua perkara sini, iaitu GDP per kapita satu pihak, maknanya negeri kaya ataupun negeri miskin, kita describe seperti demikian. Dan ada satu pihak yang lain lagi kita panggil sebagai pendapatan isi rumah. Pendapatan isi rumah ini ialah dari segi kesejahteraan. GDP per kapita ini ialah dari segi kekayaan negeri. Jadi kita mahu melihat negeri kaya, rakyat juga kaya. Kita tak mahulah sebagai negeri kaya, rakyat miskin. Jadi kalau perkara begitu berlaku, bermakna sesuatu dasar perlu dilakukan ataupun diwujudkan supaya kita katakan tadi, biarlah negeri sama-sama dengan rakyat menikmati kemakmuran hidup itu. Ya.
Sudah tentu kita berharap untuk kesejahteraan itu dinikmati dan prestasi pada tahun 2024 diterus dan dilanjutkan sehinggalah ke tahun 2025 ataupun lebih baik prestasinya. Dan kita sudah pun masuk separuh kedua tahun ini, Datuk. Mengambil kira apa yang sedang berlaku di peringkat global dengan ketegangan di Asia Barat, ketegangan perdagangan, tarif, perang di Israel dan Iran juga, sudah tentu mengambil kira juga dengan perubahan dasar domestik. Bagaimana Datuk melihat antara downside risk utama yang mempunyai keupayaan yang sangat tinggi untuk memberi kesan terhadap prestasi setiap KDNK Negeri untuk tahun 2025 ini, agar setiap negeri ini dapat bersedia dan terus menikmati dan merasai kesejahteraan?
Ini dua perkara yang saya nak sebut sini, iaitu pertama, kita bercakap tentang isu global, isu serantau. Bermakna kita sedang memerhatikan tentang business cycle yang ada di dunia dan di rantau ini. Jadi kita riding on business cycle. Makna kalau katakan ekonomi itu baik, serantau dan dunia dah baik, global baik, kita juga akan turut serta menikmatinya. Yang itu kita perlukan satu pemantauan yang rapi. Pemantauan yang rapi, kita perkemaskan pengurusan ekonomi. Supaya kita sentiasa siap siaga. Perkara yang keduanya ialah untuk jangka panjang. Untuk jangka panjang, kita perlu mempersiapkan diri kita dengan kekukuhan ekonomi, struktur ekonomi yang kukuh. Maknanya dia kita susun ekonomi kita supaya mempunyai produktiviti yang tinggi. Dan termasuk di sini produktiviti di setiap negeri-negeri tadi mesti tinggi juga. Macam seperti katakan yang saya sebut tadi, kita memasuki bidang-bidang downstream yang mempunyai nilai tambah yang tinggi. Misalnya di Kedah, di Terengganu yang saya sebutkan tadi tu, dan di negeri-negeri lain. Jadi kalau kita dan ini adalah jangka panjang, maka kalau dalam jangka pendek tadi business cycle tadi memang memberikan kelebihan kepada kita, alhamdulillah kita sedang berada di situ dan baguslah kita kerana kita mengurus ekonomi kita dengan baik. Tapi yang keduanya ialah struktur ekonomi kita tu sentiasa resilient, sentiasa kukuh dan mampan. Jadi kalau katakan business cycle tu baik, maka kita akan mendapat nikmatnya lebih tinggi lagi. Tetapi kalaulah kata ditakdirkan bahawa keadaan ekonomi dunia, keadaan ekonomi serantau agak lemah kerana gangguan-gangguan geopolitik yang sebagainya yang seperti kita hadapi sekarang ni, kita boleh menampan kelemahan-kelemahan global dunia itu, dan bukan bermakna kita pun boleh tumbuh dengan pantas, tidak, tetapi sekurang-kurangnya kita tidaklah jatuh terjerumus sedalam-dalamnya kerana kita ada kekuatan dalaman kerana struktur kita yang kukuh dan mampan itu. Ya, Nina.
Itu sangat penting message Prof. Kalau kita memperkukuhkan our internal strength, maka kita mampu menghadapi apa jua cabaran bukan hanya di peringkat nasional tapi sehinggalah ke peringkat global. Sekali lagi saya nak ucapkan terima kasih kepada Profesor Emeritus Datuk Dr. Zakir Abdul Rashid merupakan penganalisis ekonomi, dan setiap perbincangan ini akan kami rangkumkan dalam astro.com dan di semua platform digital Astro AWANI. Baik, saya akan teruskan dengan perkembangan nilai mata wang ringgit berbanding dengan mata wang dunia iaitu dolar Amerika Syarikat. Setakat pagi ini ia mencecah pada paras 4.2075. Namun kita saksikan bagaimanakah prestasi nilai ringgit Malaysia semasa ditutup semalam. Ia telah ditutup tinggi berbanding dolar Amerika Syarikat pada Selasa. Disokong oleh sentimen yang lebih baik, pasaran mata wang pesat membangun dalam persekitaran penurunan mata wang negara maju itu. Pada 6 petang, mata wang tempatan itu mengukuh kepada 4.1995 berbanding dolar Amerika Syarikat 4.2060 ketika ditutup pada Isnin. Dan prestasi setakat pagi ini ia telah dibuka pada paras 4.2075 dan dalam tempoh seminggu ataupun 7 hari nilai ringgit Malaysia berbanding dolar Amerika Syarikat mengalami tren pengukuhan. Apabila graf ini menunjukkan penurunan, mencerminkan nilai ringgit Malaysia ataupun kedudukannya semakin kukuh. Dan ini adalah prestasi penilaian nilai ringgit Malaysia yang dapat kita saksikan dalam tempoh terdekat. Baik, saya akan beralih kepada prestasi Bursa Malaysia dengan momentum belian berterusan dalam saham wajaran tinggi terpilih telah mendorong Bursa Malaysia untuk ditutup pada paras tertinggi harian pada Rabu. Menandakan prestasi kukuh bagi sesi dagangan keempat berturut-turut, kata penganalisis. Pada 5 petang, FTSE Bursa Malaysia KLCI naik 8.57 mata atau 0.56% kepada 1,541.53 daripada 1,532.96 ketika ditutup pada Isnin. Dan setakat pagi ini, Bursa Malaysia pembukaannya berada pada paras. Okey, sebelum kita melihat pada prestasi Bursa Malaysia, saya akan jawab soalan security daripada Google untuk kita memastikan ini adalah jawapan cyber security daripada internet. Dan setakat pagi ini, Bursa Malaysia dibuka pada paras 1,545.01, peningkatan sebanyak 3.48 atau 0.23% dalam tempoh 5 hari. Tempoh terdekat, paras ataupun kadar Bursa Malaysia telah mengalami tren peningkatan dan ia telah meningkat daripada paras 1,518.37 sehinggalah antara paras tertinggi pada Rabu pagi 1,545.41, dan ini adalah prestasi Bursa Malaysia, pasaran tempatan yang dapat kita saksikan setakat pembukaan 2 Julai 2025. Sudah tentu kami akan sentiasa bawakan perkembangan ini dari semasa ke semasa. Jangan ke mana-mana, banyak lagi laporan yang akan kami bawakan selepas ini.
Ayah aku mati sebab cakra. Selagi cakra masih ada, jiwa aku tak tenang.
Hari ini kita berdepan dengan ancaman yang serius yang didatangkan oleh sekumpulan pemberontak yang kita sendiri tahu, organisasi Cakra.
Untuk kalahkan cakra, we need a new set of eyes and ears.
Event government tu pun semakin dekat. Siapa yang you nak rekrut untuk penetrate Cakra? Are you sure?
Yes, I'm sure.
You tahu kan tanggungjawab yang you akan tanggung?
Kau nak apa sebenarnya ni?
Saya nak awak masuk Cakra, jadi orang kepercayaan Aziz.
Tak bahaya ke?
Saya akan ada dengan awak. Every step of the way, saya akan pastikan awak selamat.
Aku nak kau monitor Zuriel. Aku tak nak siapa-siapa tahu pasal benda ni.
Bersama-sama rakyat, kita akan bangkit. Kuasa rakyat!
Honey Trap. Stream episod terbaru dahulu, eksklusif on demand. dan 9 malam di Astro Citra.
When the superpowers move, the ground shifts. Power isn't just about might anymore. It's about narratives, networks, negotiation. We go beyond the noise to deliver laser-focused analysis on how power moves and what it means for the world. This is AWANI International, reporting the shifts in power affairs shaping the world.
Perusahaan kecil dan sederhana, impian besar. Jiwa SME Astro AWANI kembali menjelajah Malaysia. Dari Ipoh ke Kota Kinabalu, dari Melaka ke Lembah Kelang. Sesi pitching, pameran produk dan dialog bersama pemimpin industri serantau. Dapatkan inspirasi, ilmu dan peluang untuk kembangkan perniagaan anda semuanya di bawah satu bumbung. Kerana inilah medan impak sebenar. Jiwa SME menjana impak inovasi digital.
Phase 3 of Malaysia's e-invoice system rollout kicks off on Tuesday, targeting taxpayers with annual revenue between 5 million and 25 million ringgit. Inland Revenue Board IRB Deputy Chief Executive Officer Tax Operations Shaharudi Othman said approximately 55,000 taxpayers are expected to be onboarded in this phase and expressed confidence that the take-up rate would mirror previous phases. The fourth and fifth phases of the rollout will target businesses with annual income between 1 million ringgit and 5 million ringgit starting 1st January 2026 and those earning up to 1 million ringgit beginning July 1st, 2026. And for that, I welcome you. Our guest ready on the set is Havid Dempsey, the SCS Global and Council member of Tax Institute. I want to say thank you very much, Havinda, for joining us again. The last time you came to the studio, we were talking about the SSC amendment and expansion. And now we're going to add more discussion within the tax system. It's e-invoice. And we're at the phase 3. Phase 3 brings in business with 500k to 25 million ringgit turnover. Probably before we discuss long, what's the real goal behind the phase 3?
Once again, first of all, Nina, thank you for the invitation. It's good to be here. And phase 3 basically is for taxpayers with turnover of 5 million to 25 million. And so we're in the middle of this 5 phases of the implementation. And the idea here is to basically, first of all, initially there were supposed to be 3 phases. They've been expanded to 4, then subsequently now to 5. It's essentially to give taxpayers more time to be e-invoice savvy and to be able to implement e-invoicing more efficiently. So what it means for this phase 3 taxpayers actually is that also bearing in mind that e-invoicing has its own complexities and it takes time to get the systems in place. There's a lot of relaxation that actually has been given by the government. And what it means essentially is for the next 6 months, this category of taxpayers can continue to actually carry on business as usual. They can issue the normal invoices. You don't have to have an e-invoice in place. But at the end of every month, within 7 days from the end of the month, you have to do a consolidated e-invoice, which means all these normal invoices that you sent out, you will list them, the amount and the invoice number. It's just one consolidated e-invoice to be submitted to the IRB. So that makes life a lot easier. Because if you talk about individual e-invoices, you need to have the details of the customer. There are normally 6 unique details that you need to know. The name, the tax number, the ID, the address, the email address, the telephone number. And it takes time to gather all this sort of information.
Yeah.
So with the consolidated invoice, you don't need any such details. It is just putting the details of your invoice number, the normal invoice that you sent out, and the amount, and that's consolidated and submitted to the IRB. So these 6 months basically are to enable taxpayers to, don't sit on their laurels, start getting e-invoice ready. E-invoicing is here to stay. It's not going to go away. It's not going to magically disappear because it's very important for the government. E-invoicing is a tool to increase compliance, to increase the collections. And it is hoped that perhaps by the time e-invoicing is implemented in full, we will have a 30%, 40% increase in the tax collections. That's the main driver, of course, behind e-invoicing as well.
Will the grace period will help or hurt? Because we understand that July to December 2025 election period gives business more time. But do you believe it's actually helped them prepare or just delay the inevitable rush, actually?
Well, I think at the end of the day, like I said, e-invoicing is here to fully be, it's going to be implemented. There are repercussions if you do not comply. For the supplier, the businessman or the party that's carrying on the business, it's a requirement under the law to issue an e-invoice. Otherwise, you could face a fine of between 200 ringgit to 20,000 for each e-invoice that's missing. So it's down, if you're in the self-assessment system, it's always down to the taxpayer. It's the responsibility, the onus of proof and responsibility is on the taxpayer to ensure that the requirements are met. Of course, it can be a challenge to implement e-invoicing. You need to train your staff. You need to have the systems in place, which, by the way, are becoming increasingly affordable. It's not going to cost you an arm or a leg, so to speak. So it is not, to me, I feel, it is not something that you can just try to escape from by having this escapism. You need to face the reality, and we need to actually look at how to implement it. So if you delay it, if you wait for the last minute, and you hope that maybe there's another postponement from the government, which may or may not happen, because eventually the idea is to have it implemented in full. And I think however long it takes, even if it means that there has to be some further postponement or refinement of this, eventually we will get there. So I feel the 6-month relaxation period is very useful. The phase 3 taxpayers know that they are now on board, and at the very least they have to do the consolidated e-invoice. So you might as well learn how your actual e-invoicing will take place as well. And if I may just add, if you are basically dealing with consumers, business to consumer transactions, if you are a restaurant operator, if you are a supermarket, if you are a clinic, you don't actually have to issue an e-invoice for each transaction. You can still carry on business as usual, and then you do the consolidated e-invoice at the end of the day. So it is not as, I think, as tedious or as complex as some may perceive. But when you're transacting with another business to business, then e-invoicing has to be done on an individual basis. An individual e-invoice is required for every transaction. So the impact of this may not be all that significant on most parties. I think what's really important and what I'm glad about is that the government or the IRB has actually given this relaxation to enable taxpayers to be prepared to learn the ropes and try to be e-invoice savvy as quickly as possible.
You have to be tech savvy for this, upgrade your skill as well.
That's right.
We understand that, as you mentioned, that probably one of the basic necessity requirement for us to registration for invoice, we need to have basic ID, numbers, address, and number of receipt. And then, but maybe you can share with us some of the businesses industry, probably the small players, doesn't understand fully the procedure. Probably they say when the announcement of few phases of e-invoice, okay, now we have to go to class, training programs, and now we have to provide this, but they don't know the correct order of this. Maybe you can share with us, we know they have guidelines, a few pages to explain it, but maybe can simplify for us the easy step for them to start, so we understand maybe some of it can become overwhelming during this process execution, but maybe you can share with us what are the correct guidelines or steps they should start taking from taking classes to providing all the requirement documents until the end of the deadline.
Okay, I think in a way we are at that phase or that stage now where firstly we talk about the systems that are out there that can be implemented. They are very friendly and very easy to use systems. I'll just give you an example. If you go to Starbucks and you want to buy a drink, they will issue a normal receipt to you because Starbucks has already started implementing invoicing. But being a business to consumer transaction, they don't issue an e-invoice to you. They give you the normal receipt, but at the bottom there's a link, which basically links you to their, you go into that link, it links you to their website. So the purchaser, if requires an e-invoice, you want an e-invoice for yourself, you can go in and key in those 6 details, right? And submit, enter, it goes into Starbucks system. Starbucks system is linked to IRB's portal. The e-invoice is validated and you have it. It will be emailed to you, etc. Now that same system can be tweaked and has been tweaked by the providers, the software providers and this systems providers, to be used in the kedai nasi ayam or whatever as well. So you go there and you will be given a tablet. If it's point of sales kind of transaction, you press, so the operator presses nasi ayam for 5 ringgit or whatever, it goes into the system, it gets linked to the IRB's portal, and you have an e-invoice basically given on the spot. And these systems can actually be, purchased or subscribed for on a monthly basis for very affordable prices, 100 ringgit, 200 ringgit, 1,000 ringgit, depending on, the requirements of the party. So to me, I think what's important to share, firstly, is that there are such systems available. Basically, the awareness of that is not really out there. It is not going to, like I said, cost you an arm and a leg to basically implement e-invoicing. If you talk about the starting step for e-invoicing, very quickly, just to go back one step, an e-invoice essentially is, from the technical perspective, it is, what do you call it, a representation, digital representation of the transaction. If I'm selling my services to you, I will put in our details, I will put in your name, my name, and relevant details, the amounts, and submit it to the IRB's portal for validation. For that, I can actually use IRB's My Invoice portal as well, which is provided free of charge. So it is there, the facility is there, and it's quite robust now. Initially, there were teething problems, but it's there for everybody to use as a facility. And once I've submitted, that e-invoice will be, once validated by the IRB, you and I will both be notified about the validation. And I can then share that e-invoice to you to say that, Nina, you owe me this money, can you please pay? I can give you a visual representation of that. And you can either reject it or accept it. You got 72 hours to reject that e-invoice. And all these things are actually part of the system of every e-invoice transaction that is carried out. And I suppose the understanding of that, the awareness of that can be shared with the employees, with the people that are going to implement e-invoicing. That the entire system, basically what it entails, the processes that are entailed. So once the e-invoice, you don't reject it, you accept it, I have not overbilled you, for example, it will be in the IRB's portal for the next 10 years, right? It's there to stay. And so actually it is, the whole idea behind this, firstly, is for the IRB, for the tax authorities to be privy to the transaction, to know that I have done such a sale. They can monitor me eventually to see whether I've reported that, I've paid taxes on that income. Those are some of the things that are there. But this entire process of validation, creation, etc., is simplified in those instances. Like
What are some of the common mistakes usually for taxpayer? We know common mistake they typically do within final preparation for this.
Well, the first mistake is to firstly assume that, perhaps this can be done at the last minute. Right? That shouldn't be the case. That's been the challenge, I think, for us as the consultants to many of the SMEs, right? They take this wait-and-see attitude. But like I said, it's not going to go away. There's been a bit of a deferment, but it's eventually going to come in. So we need to emphasize on the need to be prepared as quickly as possible. The other issue is perhaps not understanding exactly what the requirements are. For example, if you are a manufacturer, a small manufacturer as well, and you're going to import materials from overseas, in the past you would just do the customs clearance, you have an invoice coming in from overseas, you make the payment. Right now there's a requirement for this manufacturer to basically issue a self-billed e-invoice within 2 months from the end of the month in which the customs clearance is obtained. So you got things like understanding the requirement for e-invoicing and then self-billed e-invoices. The differences between the two need to be understood. You need to know the deadlines for the various types of e-invoices to be issued. So mistakes will be along the lines of not understanding, not knowing, not doing a proper gap analysis between your current systems, what they are and what they should be. And if I may just add on one more thing, to assume that the current system of the invoicing that we do, right? For example, if I were to sell my goods to you or provide my services to you, currently I will invoice when the services have been rendered or the goods have been delivered. Right? If I receive any advance payments, it will be recorded as a prepayment for accounting purposes. With e-invoicing, that advance payment requires an e-invoice to be issued separately. So it's an additional transaction which requires.
Probably my last question, we have only less than 1 minute. What's next after e-invoice? Do you see e-invoice eventually link up to SST like transfer pricing and then even BEPS reporting? Should the taxpayer be preparing for that now? Less than 1 minute, sorry.
Yeah. E-invoicing actually basically, it's a unified invoicing system. It will allow for digitalized financial reporting. It will it's actually e-invoicing requirements also have all this data for customs, which can be used for indirect tax purposes, SST, sales tax, import duty purposes. In terms of related party transactions, it can also be the data can be massaged to look at the requirements for transfer pricing. So eventually, if there's a need to implement GST as well, the invoicing platform it can accommodate GST as well, right? Because it's, after all, an issue of putting in a transactional tax, right, for every transaction that takes place.
I want to say thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are at the end of the session. Definitely, I will invite you more again to fully understand all the system within the e-invoice SST. Again, I want to say thank you very much to Habib Nasir, the SCS Global and Council member of Tax Institute, and definitely all of our discussion here will be featured in astro.com across all social media. See you again, Habib.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, for our next update on the news is US President Donald Trump on Tuesday threatened to cut off the billions of dollars in subsidies that Elon Musk companies receive from the federal government. This is an escalation of the war of words between the president and the world's richest man, one-time allies who have since fallen out.
The feud between Elon Musk and Donald Trump reignited after Musk criticized Trump's tax and spending bill, which aims to cut EV subsidies that have long benefited Tesla. Though Musk has called for ending government subsidies, Tesla has historically gained from billions in tax credits. The bill, which includes eliminating a $7,500 EV tax credit, narrowly passed the Senate on Tuesday. Trump responded by saying Musk is upset about losing his EV mandate and warned he could lose even more. On Truth Social, Trump accused Musk of receiving more subsidies than any human in history and hinted at halting Tesla-related support, no more rocket launches, satellites or EV production. Tesla shares fell over 5% on Tuesday following the escalation. Musk replied on X saying, "I am literally saying cut it all, but held back from further attacks for now." Republicans worry the feud could hurt their chances in the 2026 midterms. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent defended the bill against Musk's deficit concerns, while Trump joked that Musk's government efficiency initiative, DOGE, might have to go back and eat Elon.
The Nasdaq closed lower on Tuesday, July 1st, dragged down by weakness in large-cap tech stocks, while the Dow ended higher in a volatile session marked by seasonally low liquidity. The session was marked by mixed signals. The NIFI index, which tracks 10 heavily traded tech names, fell more than 1%.
US President Donald Trump said he was not thinking of extending the July 9 deadline for countries to negotiate trade deals with the US. The Senate's passage of Trump's tax package had investors weighing the bill's stimulative effects against its multi-trillion-dollar cost. Tesla shares were hit by a renewed spat between CEO Elon Musk and Trump, while economic data backed by the US Central Bank's patient stance on rate cuts. Tesla dropped more than 4% after Trump threatened to cut off the billions of dollars in subsidies that Musk's companies get from the federal government. Musk had revived his criticism of Trump's wide-ranging tax cut and spending bill. Earlier in the day, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell reiterated the US Central Bank plans to wait and learn more about the impact of tariffs on inflation before lowering rates, again setting aside Trump's demands for immediate and deep rate cuts.
Chair Powell went out of his way to make clear that although he was going to focus very much on doing his job free of any political persuasion, politics has played into how the Fed has reacted. And the threat of tariffs and the implementation of tariff policy had put the Fed on hold when it would have otherwise been happy to cut rates, which was a bit of a bombshell news item from the chairman of the central bank, but practically does illustrate that there is a true myth of independence of the Fed. It is impossible to drive fiscal policy and monetary policy of the country being completely unaware of political policies and pressures or the fiscal state of the economy. And Chairman Powell made that very clear today.
The S&P 500 lost 6.94 points or 0.11% to end at 6,198.01 points, while the Nasdaq Composite lost 166.85 points or 0.82% to 20,202.89. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 400.17 points or 0.91% to 44,494.94.
All right, now let's break it down what's happening in the US stock market. I'm going to start for one of the biggest sector within the technology, S&P 500. Microsoft is down by 1.08%. And the recent update about Microsoft is the English Premier League, and Microsoft on Tuesday announced a 5-year partnership where the cloud giant will infuse its artificial intelligence co-pilot into the league's digital platforms to provide quick facts and statistics about matches. Audiences and fans will be able to learn about Premier League, clubs, players, matches through an AI companion powered by Microsoft's Copilot, which can pull information from over 30 seasons of stats, 300,000 articles and 9,000 videos, they said. AI has strongly resonated with sports leagues and sports entertainment companies as they look to streamline the vast troves of data to attract a larger audience and drive engagement. And next, one of the biggest companies within the semiconductor industry is NVIDIA. Is down by 3.96% as of this morning, almost achieving 4%. And the recent update on NVIDIA, insiders sold over $1 billion worth of company stock in the past year, with a notable uptick in recent trading activity as executives capitalized on surging investors' interest in artificial intelligence, the Financial Times reported on Sunday. More than $500 million of the share sales took place this month as the California-based chip designer's share price climbed to an all-time high, the report said. Jensen Huang, NVIDIA's chief executive, started selling shares this week for the first time since September, the SEC filing show. And next update, we have Apple also. Apple is up with the great performance, up by 1.2%. And the latest update on Apple is waiting using artificial intelligence technology from Anthropic or OpenAI to power a new version of Siri instead of its own in-house models, Bloomberg News reported on Monday. Shares of the iPhone maker, which had traded down earlier in the session, closed 2% higher on Monday. Apple has had discussion with both companies about using their large language models for Siri, asking them to train versions of their LLMs that could run on Apple's cloud infrastructure for testing, the report said, citing people familiar with the discussion. And for Meta is also up by 0.49%, almost 0.50%, and Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg has organized the company's artificial intelligence efforts under a new division called Meta Superintelligence Labs, according to a source on Monday. The division will be headed by Alexander Wang, former CEO of data labeling startup Skill AI. He will be the Chief AI Officer of the new initiative at the social media giant, the source said. The high-stakes push follows senior staff departures and a poor reception for Meta's latest open-source Llama 4 model, challenges that have allowed rivals including Google, OpenAI and China's DeepSeek to seize momentum in the AI race. Zuckerberg hopes the new lab will fast-track work on artificial general intelligence machines that can outtake humans and help create new cash flows from the Meta AI app, image to video, ad tools and smart glasses. And we also have the automotive by Elon Musk is down. One of the highest low performance as of this morning is 5.34% as for Tesla. And that is the overview of some of the updates within the S&P 500, which is the international market. And stay tuned with us as we will bring more update right after this break.
Ada yang perdebatan bahawa GST perlu dikembalikan semula kerana ada yang mempertikaikan bahawa SST itu tidak efektif.
Isu buruh kanak-kanak bukan sahaja dalam bentuk fizikal tetapi juga bentuk moden yang lebih licik dan juga terselindung.
Kita tengok buruh kanak-kanak dan ada juga buruh paksa kanak-kanak.
Kumpulan FB dikenali sebagai grup budak-budak sekolah rendah yang didakwa menyebarkan gambar remaja perempuan tidak senonoh telah pun ditutup.
Di dalam setiap berita yang dibawa, konteks amat penting. Kami sentiasa membawakan yang tergempar dan terkini. Pastikan Astro AWANI menjadi pilihan anda, tidak kira di mana sahaja anda berada.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to Investing Amid High Debt, Low Growth. My name is Stacey Vanek-Smith. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg and host of the podcast Everybody's Business from Bloomberg Business Week. And I am here to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Frieden. Dr. Frieden is a political economist at Columbia, though he is with Harvard for many years. And he is author of the book Global Capitalism, Its Fall and Rise in the 20th Century. Though he tells me the latest edition, they tweaked the title, which is now Global Capitalism, Its Fall and Rise in the 20th Century, and Its Stumbles in the 21st, which feels like a pretty perfect segue to our talk today. Dr. Frieden has spent years studying the relationship between trade and peace and the labor economy and debt. And I think we're incredibly lucky to be hearing from him today at this moment of such profound change. Pretty much since the end of World War II, the economy has been moving towards free trade. That has really shaped our global economy. It has shaped the world we live in, and that is changing right now. I really can't think of a better person to walk us through how we got to this moment and what all the changes of this moment are going to mean for the global economy and for all of us. And so with that, Dr. Frieden.
Thank you, Stacey. It's a great pleasure to be here. We are wondering what's happening with globalization. And to try to address that, I want to use a little bit of history, a little bit of theory, and a little bit of current events. Let's start with the history. This is not the first age of globalization. The first age of globalization was in the 19th and early 20th century. It lasted many, many decades. And as you can see from this, the world economy was very tightly integrated, international trade at very high levels. On some dimensions, the world economy was perhaps more tightly integrated than it is today. All of the major economies were tied together by the gold standard, something like a single currency. Immigration, if you were a European, was almost completely free. No documents, no papers, right? And that international economic order that lasted most of the late 19th and early 20th century was, by most standards, a great success. It was marked by rapid economic growth. In fact, the world economy grew more in the 75 years of that first age of globalization than it had in the previous 1,000 years. And most governments around the world agreed that it was a very good thing and should continue. And yet, that first era of globalization came to a crashing halt with World War I. Now, World War I was, of course, a war. You don't continue an international economy in the midst of a world war. But after the war was over, the governments of the world made every attempt to resuscitate and revive that international economic order, that first era of globalization, and failed. Conferences, treaties, international organizations, nothing was able to reconstitute that first era of globalization, despite the fact that all of the governments of the world, roughly speaking, agreed that it had been a good thing and should be rebuilt. So what was the problem? It all came to a head in 1929 when a recession in the United States led to the Smoot-Hawley tariff, trade protection, brief recession elsewhere, defaults in Europe, higher trade protection elsewhere, international financial crises, bank runs, and within a few years, the world economy was dead in the water. International trade, a fraction of what it had been. International finance, flat for the next 40 years. International investment, largely non-existent. So what happened? Why could this international economic order not be reconstituted? Well, the classical gold standard free trade era had pretty rigorous rules of the game, as was talked about at the time. If you were a member of this order, you were expected to subordinate your domestic, your national economy to the requirements of the international economic order. If your economy was out of balance, you were expected to impose austerity measures to bring it back to balance. Austerity measures that could be very painful. How is that sustainable? Well, the people who were being asked to bear the burden of adjustment, who were experiencing these sacrifices and this pain in order to maintain international economic integration, had no political voice. The major economies of the world were not democracies. Those that considered themselves democracies would not be considered democracies today. And so the people who were being asked to bear the burden of adjustment of that classical gold standard era were not able to protest. That began to change in the 1890s, and it especially changed during and after World War I. By the early 1920s, every major economy, every major advanced economy was in fact a democracy, with universal suffrage, even for women. Miracle of miracles, right? And that meant that people who had not had a political voice now had one. Labor unions and socialist parties that had been weak, suppressed, even illegal before this era, in the late 19th and early 20th century, by the 1920s were strong, powerful. Virtually every country in Europe had a socialist party in government, in some cases the leading party of government. And that meant that the ability of governments to impose these very painful austerity measures was strictly limited, because the labor movements and the socialist parties and the farmer parties and the middle class parties would no longer stand for it. So governments tried over and over to impose the kind of rigor that had characterized that gold standard era and failed. And in fact, John Maynard Keynes spent most of the interwar period pleading with policymakers and his fellow economists not to, in his words, impose the nostrums of a Victorian era on societies that are no longer Victorian. The economies had changed, the politics had changed. As Keynes put it, economies that had been characterized by family firms and family farms and disorganized labor now had big business and big labor. Right? And so, despite all the attempts to restore it, the world economy collapsed into trade wars, and then currency wars, and eventually shooting wars. After 2 world wars and the worst economic calamity in modern history, in the aftermath of World War II, the major countries of the world reconstituted an international economic order, a Western economic order. That economic order was also extraordinarily successful. As you probably know, world trade began to grow almost immediately after World War II and has continued to grow for some 70 years. Right? That, like the first era of globalization, that international economic order was quite successful. Poor countries caught up with middle-income countries caught up with rich countries. Right? Economic growth was, again, more rapid than it had been in all of human history. Right? There were a variety of characteristics of that international economic order. Right? There were two pillars, and those two pillars were American leadership and multilateralism. American leadership in the sense that the U.S. essentially built that post-war economic order. And it built it, to be sure, in a way that was consistent with American interests. But it also built it in a way that responded to the concerns of other countries. Multilateralism meant that there were institutions established that in some sense committed the U.S. to take other countries' concerns into account. Other countries had a vote, had a voice at the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, eventually the WTO. And that was a bit of a guarantee that the U.S. would not abuse its extraordinary position to exploit other countries. Those two pillars were essential to the international economic order built in the 1940s and 1950s by the United States and its close allies in the Western world. Right? As I say, it was extraordinarily successful. But, as you undoubtedly know, it has stalled. International trade has stalled. Globalization has stalled. And there are increasing concerns about whether this international economic order can be sustained and maintained. Those concerns largely come from within the advanced economies of the world, including the United States, which I'll focus on. Right? Those concerns come from the fact that more and more of our people feel that the world economy is not serving them, that globalization has served to enrich a narrow elite, college-educated, people in the knowledge industries, people in the prosperous big cities, that they are being asked to make sacrifices to maintain a globalization that doesn't serve them. And you know what? They're not wrong. Right? If you look at what's happened in the United States over that period, you can see the U.S., and I'm focusing on the U.S. for which we have data and which I know best, over the last 40 and more years, per capita GDP in the U.S. has approximately doubled. But the real income of the median American household, of the typical middle-class American household, has risen by about 30%. The rest of that growth has gone to the wealthiest third of the American population. People with college educations, people in the knowledge industries, people in the prosperous big cities on the coasts, right? And it has not gone to the American middle class, to the American working class. And this pattern is repeated over and over throughout most of the advanced economies of the world. You can see here the pattern that I've just described. Remember that 2/3 of Americans do not have a college degree. And then take a look at this graph. The top two lines are people with a college or postgraduate degree. The middle line is people with some college. The next line is people with a high school degree. The line after that is people who do not have a high school degree. And you can see, and we're talking here about more than 40 years, 45 and more years, in which the real wage of people without a college degree has been stagnant or has declined. So the perception that globalization has not served large parts of our population is not wrong. And more of our people feel that governments have failed to protect them from the vagaries of the world economy, from the negative effects of globalization. Everything comes with a cost. That governments have not listened to them, have not reflected their interests, have not represented their concerns. And as people have become increasingly dissatisfied with government, they have lost faith in existing politicians, existing political parties, existing political institutions. And that's given rise to a dramatic increase in support for populist political movements that question not only globalization and European integration, but, oops, that went too fast. Let's slow it down a little bit. Not only European integration and globalization, but in some cases, the very bases of our democratic system. Steady increase in populism in the US, in Western Europe. And that is the backdrop I think we need to understand to the Trump administration. Donald Trump ran for office in 2016 on a platform that was explicitly hostile to international trade, international finance, international investment. I should point out that he was not alone, because Bernie Sanders, running for the nomination of the Democratic Party, ran on a very similar platform. You can look at the stump speeches of Sanders and Trump, and they look almost identical in their rejection of globalization. Right? And the Trump administration in office, in the first administration, delivered on those promises, ran on again in 2020, ran on them again in 2024, and now has delivered on those promises in spades. Right? The Trump administration has been quite clear that it does not accept as given those two pillars of the international economic order, American leadership and multilateralism. They don't accept American leadership as it has been understood because they, and many Americans who support them, feel that the U.S. is overstretched and overburdened, not getting what it needs out of the international economic order or the international political order more generally. They reject, in most instances, multilateralism because, again, the Trump administration, Donald Trump, has been quite clear that he doesn't feel, and the administration doesn't feel, that multilateralism, as currently constituted, serves American interests. The United States is better served, they say, by unilateral ties, unilateral bargains with individual countries, bilateral bargains, working out deals on a one-to-one basis. Why be restricted by the rules of multilateral institutions? Why listen to what a dispute settlement system in the World Trade Organization tells the U.S. to do, given a complaint from Costa Rica? We can bargain directly with Costa Rica and get a much better deal. Right? So the Trump administration has rejected large aspects of that international economic order, and I have a quote here, I have just to be able to read it, from Donald Trump speaking early in his first administration to the UN General Assembly. America is governed by Americans. We reject the ideology of globalism. Responsible nations must defend against threats to sovereignty from global governance. Threats to sovereignty from global governance. We will never surrender America's sovereignty to an unelected, unaccountable global bureaucracy. Right. Now, there are some in the administration who reject multilateralism completely, and there are others who believe only that it needs to be dramatically reformed and revised. When Scott Bessent spoke at the IMF World Bank meetings a couple of months ago in Washington, he insisted that the IMF and the World Bank had to be rebuilt on the basis of their founding charters, that they had strayed too far from what they should be doing, and at this point were too far from America's interests, too far from America's concerns. So whether you're of the faction that believes that multilateralism has to be dramatically revised, or that it should be jettisoned, the Trump administration has made it quite clear that its commitment to multilateralism is definitely under question. This is the new reality that all countries in the world face, that the pillars of the international economic order, as we have experienced them really through our entire lifetimes, are now threatened by the most important country in the world, the United States. And countries will have to adjust and adapt and figure out how they will react to this new reality. And I want to give you an example that I think is relevant to my country, the United States, relevant to China as well, and relevant to the world. For the past 25 years, the world economy has been characterized by an unusual set of features. One group of countries in the world has had as its engine of economic growth exporting massive quantities, largely of manufactured goods, to the rest of the world. That is how they have grown. China, obviously among them, but not just China. Japan, Germany, Vietnam, all these countries have had as their secret of growth exporting to the rest of the world, consumers of the world. The second big group of countries are countries that have lived by borrowing and using the borrowed funds to consume the goods of the first group. So you've got the world divided between surplus countries and deficit countries. And that has persisted for 25 years, what we call in the business global macroeconomic imbalances. And many of us have been arguing for a good 20 years or so that these global macroeconomic imbalances are unsustainable in the long run. It is not sustainable to have one set of countries running surpluses ad infinitum and another set of countries running deficits ad infinitum. And rigorous social science theory tells us that if something is unsustainable, it will eventually come to an end. That end has been accelerated by the Trump administration that has made it quite clear that it will not stand for the pattern of deficits and surpluses that has characterized the world economy for the last 25 years. That imposes some very, very strict restraints on countries around the world, because they will have to adjust to a new environment in which they can no longer run the kinds of surpluses or deficits that they have. And that's not easy, because national economies are not motorcycles that you can turn around on a dime in a narrow alleyway. To turn a national economy around from one pattern of economic growth to another pattern of economic growth is economically difficult, politically difficult, and socially difficult. To take the example of China, to turn China from a country which is an exporting powerhouse, whose economic activity is oriented towards manufactured exports to the Western and other markets, to an economy that focuses on domestic consumption is not easy. It threatens entrenched interests. It threatens politically powerful interests. It threatens the economic activity of large segments of the economy. Right? And the Chinese government has been talking for 20 years about the need to rebalance and has been unable to achieve it for very good reasons. It's not easy. The U.S. faces similar problems, because if we're going to wean ourselves off of the borrowing that we have engaged in for the last 25 years and more, we will have to increase our savings and reduce our consumption. And increasing savings and reducing consumption is painful. American administrations for 25 years have talked about doing this, and none of them have actually done it. So the world faces some very serious challenges. Adapting to this new international economic environment will be difficult economically, politically, and socially. I believe that we are at the end of an era. Maybe we're at the beginning of the end of an era, but I think that the post-war economic order that we have come to know, that we have all grown up in, is coming to an end. I don't know what will replace it. If I did, I would tell you, but I don't. What I do know is that whatever happens over the next few years, as this order comes to an end and is replaced by something else, will affect the quality of lives of our children and our children's children, and probably our children's children's children. I got into this business of thinking about the intersection of international politics and international economics because I was convinced that this intersection, this interaction, profoundly affected and profoundly affects the lives of billions of people around the world, most of whom don't understand that. I think it's important for us to recognize that decisions we make over the next few years will affect the lives of billions of people going forward. My hope is that as we think about this, and as the countries and people of the world work towards a new international economic order, that they will do that in a way that is both wise and successful. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Stacey.
Thank you, Dr. Frieden. That was a fascinating presentation, and it is a strange moment to be living through such a profound transition. I wanted to ask first about something that came up very early in your presentation, which is what seems to be the relationship between war and trade. I'm just thinking of the end of World War II, this idea of free trade going forward. What do you see as that relationship?
Well, conflict among nations obviously is not conducive to international trade, and there is some evidence that countries that trade more with each other tend not to have such conflictual relations.
Countries that trade together.
Stay together, right. Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State during World War II and was in many ways one of the architects of the Bretton Woods system, used to say that we never went to war with a country with which we, the United States, never went to war with a country with which we had a reciprocal trade agreement. So there's some evidence to that effect. It's not ironclad, but it's pretty good. There's another aspect, which is that trade can often be justified, and trade liberalization can be justified on national security grounds. And that's in fact what happened in the 1940s and early 1950s in the US. Remember that the US had been isolationist through most of the interwar period. The Republican Party won the 1946 election, which was not a presidential election. They had the House and the Senate, and they had been very isolationist.
We are not going to participate in this.
They did not want to sign the Bretton Woods Agreement. They did not want the British loan. They did not want the Marshall Plan. They were led by Robert Taft, who ran for president on an isolationist platform. And so the Truman administration had to convince the Republicans to invest in, to believe in trade liberalization, economic ties with our allies. And they did so on national security grounds by saying, if we don't open our markets to the Europeans and the Japanese, they will go communist. And that convinced the Republicans. That convinced Arthur Vandenberg to sign on to trade liberalization for national security reasons. Now, over time, I think more and more Republicans began to believe in international trade, finance, and investment until relatively recently. But that was the justification that was given. There are people, in fact, who say that the loss of faith in international trade on the part of many Americans is related to the end of the Cold War. No more Cold War, no need to trade with our allies. Let them do things on their own. So there is a complex relationship between trade and national security conflict, as we see even today.
I've spoken with economists for many years about this, and there has always seemed to be a consensus that free trade is good for everybody. It lifts everybody up. We're all wealthier, specifically from the point of view of the U.S. Like, we can afford all of these goods we wouldn't be able to otherwise afford. It elevates everybody's quality of life. It seems like maybe there are big gaps in that story, which you talked about. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on that, and then maybe talk about what that gap looks like in other countries.
Right. So international trade, almost everyone would agree, is good for what we call aggregate social welfare. It does improve the national economy. But anyone who tells you that there are no trade-offs in economics or in life is either lying or stupid.
Or selling you something.
Or selling you something, probably. The reality is that while trade is good for aggregate social welfare, and there's a lot of evidence to that effect, we have evidence from both history and contemporary examples, it also creates winners and losers. And neoclassical trade theory teaches us that it creates winners and losers. This is nothing new, and every economist should know that trade liberalization will create losers. Now, it creates more winners than losers, and that leads to what we sometimes call the compensation hypothesis. That is, if there's something that's good for the economy as a whole, but makes some people winners and some people losers, you can tax the winners and use that to compensate the losers. And you're still going to have people better off. It's a Pareto improvement. The problem, of course, is that the winners don't like being taxed to compensate the losers, so that often doesn't happen. It varies from country to country. The U.S. does not have much of a compensation scheme along these lines. Some of the Northern European countries have more. And there is evidence that countries that have a broader, deeper, more significant social safety net have had less of a populist backlash controlling for the kinds of shocks that they've had. Right? It's perhaps not surprising, some would say, that two countries that have some of the weakest of the social safety nets, the UK and the US, have had some of the strongest reactions, some of the strongest, in this case, anti-European and anti-globalization reactions. So there is a way for governments to address some of the costs of globalization, the costs of trade liberalization. It's not easy, it's not cheap, and it's politically difficult.
What about this particular moment that we're in right now, as we're all sitting here? How did we get to this moment? What happened?
I think that at some point in the 1990s, early 2000s, governments around the world, in the advanced countries especially, began to say the traditional manufacturing is the past. The knowledge industries are the future. We're going to invest our energies, our political base, our resources in the knowledge industries, in the college educated, in the young. And so we got country after country that is divided. The US has the prosperous Northeast, the prosperous West Coast, the prosperous big cities in between, which are filled with college educated knowledge industry workers, and then it's got the rest of the country. And this pattern is repeated over and over. The north of England, the north of France, eastern Germany, southern Italy, all of these are areas that have lost much of their industrial base, where regions have suffered very seriously because of the decline in good-paying manufacturing jobs, and where governments have essentially said, well, that's the past. We're going to ignore that and move on to the modern future economy. And although from an economic standpoint that makes perfect sense, politically it turns out to be very, very dangerous because
there
are people left behind. And it is not surprising that being economically left behind in this way, that is losing a few jobs in factories in small cities, doesn't stop there. You lose those jobs, property values go down, local property taxes go down, local ability to provide local public services go down, the schools get worse, some of the more educated people leave, the infrastructure declines, law enforcement declines, and people are stuck. And it's not surprising in the American context that these distressed areas that have been distressed for decades, not for a few years, for decades, are also ground zero for things like opioid overdoses, alcoholism, suicidality, what Case and Deaton have called deaths of despair. So these are areas that really have gone through very difficult times and have basically been ignored by most of the advanced countries' governments. And now, so to speak, the chickens are coming home to roost.
This moment that we seem to be transitioning into of maybe friendshoring or not as much free trade as we're used to, if we play that out, what does this world that we're walking into look like? Who are the winners and who are the losers?
Yeah, I think that is what remains to be decided. I think that it seems that the direction the Trump administration wants to move in is one in which there is an American sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, with the U.S. less engaged with Europe and maybe engaged economically with Asia, but not so much politically. How the rest of the world adapts to that is really up for grabs. It can continue on with the kind of multilateral institutions that have characterized the world economy for the past 75 years, or fragment among itself. And I think those are questions that every country, every government, every person really has to ask. What kind of world do we want to create as things start to fragment in the contemporary international economic order?
And within the countries themselves, how do you see things evening out with the countries that are high debt, high consumption, and the countries that are high production, high...
These are some really serious adjustment problems.
Okay.
And every country is going to have to deal with them, starting with the U.S. It is not going to be easy. It is not going to be politically easy. It's not going to be economically easy. But it's going to have to be addressed.
All right. I think we are close to our time, but thank you so much, Dr. Frieden. This is a
great pleasure.
Fascinating topic. And thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you. Thanks, Stacey.
Thank you.